Harold Bruder is a well-known painter and was chairman of the art department at Queens College, where he taught for 30 years. He has lectured and written extensively on singers and singing. Here he discusses his introduction to opera, his studies with Vera Schwarz, and his first experiences at the Metropolitan Opera.
I studied with 4 teachers, but I didn't come from a cultured background. My parents knew nothing about music, and my sister also knew nothing about music, even though she studied the piano. And so my musical education came from movies, Nelson Eddy and Jeanette MacDonald. You know, I would attempt to imitate Nelson Eddy, and surely I didn't imitate Jeanette MacDonald. But the thing is that, you know, my sister and I used to sing like, you know, my heart is aching for someone and you are that someone. So we would do these routines together from the movies. But that was my background in classical music. I wasn't in the television generation. Television didn't even come into our homes until I was 18 or 19. So I grew up with radio. So it was very different. But I did go to the High School of Music and Art. So while I was an art major, I knew many musicians, you know, because we went to regular classes together. It was only in those 1 or 2 classes a day related to art or music that we would separate. And in my particular class at that time, Gloria Davy, who sang with the Met, was in my class, and she sang once or twice in the auditorium, and so there were others. So that was the background. So it came from popular media and the movies, and from classmates, and whatever little you could hear on the radio. I thought I could sing. I thought I had a good voice. Like, I thought I could imitate, you know, the crooners, because that was the day of the crooners, Perry Como, Frank Sinatra, whomever. And I once even auditioned for Dick Hames' mother, Nora Hames, who, you know, it just was a complete farce, but that was, you know, the idea that I wanted to take singing lessons. And my mother had some people she knew who 2 children were singers. And I met the son, who was a school teacher, but he sang with this kind of resonant, you know, operatic sounding voice. And he was studying with a man named Sidney Deitch, who I had never heard of. But he said that there were these exercises. And once I learned all these exercises, that would build the voice up. And so I went for a while doing these exercises, but I never sounded like Lennon Warren, so who studied with Sidney Deitch. So I stopped. My mother went to one of these women's club meetings, and a group of students of a certain teacher performed there. And she was so impressed, she went up to the teacher afterwards and said her son wanted to study singing. So I had an audition with him, and his name was Misha Hoffman. And he was really an accompanist, and he was trained in Russia, in Odessa. He was a tremendous musician. He could transpose anything at sight to any key. He was a trained accompanist, and he also could conduct. His wife was a soprano named Rasha Nikolaskaya, who once gave a recital when I was a student. She gave a recital in Town Hall, and she was very Russian. They shortened the name to Rasha Nikol, and I thought that was terrible because I loved Nikolaskaya. Rasha Nikol was terrible. Didn't give any of the feeling of this woman with the bleach blonde hair, heavy set. But they were trying, like many Europeans, many immigrants were trying to assimilate. They were trying to be American. And, you know, I knew my parents that way, and I know it's. But I studied with Misha Hoffman for about 2 years. And Hoffman later became Nikolai Gedda's coach. That was his claim to fame. That afterwards I thought he was a very bad teacher of vocal technique, but a tremendous musical educator, because he used to play records for me. And so he played records of Shayapin, he played records of Tito Skipa, he played records, so that I became educated by the records he would play for me. And he taught me a little bit of, well, not solfege, but he taught me some theory. So he taught me how to conduct, how to count time and how to conduct. He played a lot of recordings, and that was the best part of his teaching. He trained me as a bass. Clearly, you can tell by my speaking voice I'm not a bass, and I never was, but he trained me as a bass. When I auditioned for Vera Schwarz, and I said I was trained as a bass, she laughed, as she always did at everything I said, because she had a very sarcastic sense of humor, and I was this stupid American boy, who was very naive, and but she thought it was hysterically funny that I was trained as a bass. She thought with proper training, I could become a Helden. She was training me toward becoming a Helden tenor, and she said she wanted to for me to get a Fulbright to go and start singing in German opera houses, but it never came. But I studied with Mischa Hoffman for a while, and that was really part of the musical education. And then afterwards, I graduated from Cooper Union, where I went to art school, and a friend of mine and I started trying to start our own business by designing record album covers. Again, the interest in music. So we met this fellow, I forget his name, but his first name was Ernst, and his company was a Turner Records, and he had gotten the records out of Europe, but he had shelves built with all these 78s in them, and of course he popularized Taube here and Vera Schwarz with Taube here.
Ich danke vom Herzen, ich wollte nur mit liebevoll zu scherzen. Das ist ja die Gräfin Kralova. Dieser Quatsch ist etwas teuer, habt ihr mir nicht ungeheuer.
And he introduced me to Vera Schwarz, because he knew her and he had gotten some of the recordings from her. And she was teaching here, and she was teaching a lot of people. She was teaching Rize Stevens, she was coaching Zinka Milanov. I remember her mentioning Donald Dame to me. I met Hilda Guden at a lesson there, and she was very connected in the music world. When George London came over here, she knew London well from Vienna, even though he hadn't been there. He only been there a couple of years or whatever. But the thing is that she was part of that Viennese society because she had sung there for many, many, many years. So I worked with Schwarz only a brief period of time, I would say only about 6 months, but she changed everything totally. She was by far the best teacher I ever had, because she did a series of scales, and all the vocalizing was done on the E vowel so that it would bring everything forward. And it wasn't any of this it was all get the sound forward. Because what she said about my previous training was that in order to make me sound like a bass, the teacher had thrown the voice all the way in the throat, all the way in back. And it was supposed to be exactly the opposite. And I found that in a very short time of working with her, that whole upper register opened up, and she would vocalize. She was having me vocalize up to a B flat on top, and she would giggle and say a bass. But she was very sarcastic, very funny. She had funny things to say about Tauber, who she worked with, and almost everybody else. very sarcastic, but nice, in the same way that she thought all Americans were stupid, she also was very nice. And then the last teacher I worked with, I was about 30, and I had stopped studying with Vera Schwarz when I was about 21. There was a cantor at a local synagogue who was supposed to have been an opera singer. And since I was focused still on Schwartz's idea about bringing the voice forward, I was conscious of the fact that this man's speaking voice was totally hoarse. But when he sang, the voice was not hoarse. The voice was absolutely brilliant and clear. And I spoke to him. We got to know one another a little bit. His name was Vittorio Weinberg. And Vittorio Weinberg is the sharpless on the Margaret Sheridan Butterfly. He had sung at La Scala in the late 20s. He had then gone back to Israel and started a school in Jerusalem. And, so there was this whole history. He was originally born in Jerusalem. But Weinberg and I became friendly, and he asked me if I would exchange singing lessons for painting lessons. He wanted me to give him painting lessons. I hadn't really begun teaching at that time, but I started teaching him. He was a sort of a naive painter with great enthusiasm. But he taught me, Weinberg claimed that he had studied with Mattia Battistini in Milan. He had met him and studied with him while he was studying in Italy. He studied in Italy after leaving Jerusalem. And I took it with a grain of salt because Battistini has always said never took students and never taught. So even though there are several people who claim they studied with him, you get the names rising every now and again. But Weinberg claimed he studied with him. And I never believed it, really. But Weinberg gave me one exercise, which I still remember, which was memma, 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 and you went all the way up, and then down, but it was memma. So it was like the hum, working off that humming sound. That's the way I interpreted it later. But Weinberg used that exercise as part of the whole vocalizing thing. And then I was reading once, I think in Jerome Hines' book of interviews with people, I forget who it was, said that he learned this memma exercise from some fellow up in Connecticut who claimed to be a student of Battistini's. So all of a sudden, Weinberg had some credibility in that, and maybe Battistini did teach. Margarita Ziems, the great Dresden soprano, whom I wrote about a few times, she said that she learned the most of any of her teachers from Battistini. Now, when and where and how could Margarita Ziems have studied with Battistini? Except that Battistini did sing in Dresden and, throughout the period. So he might have coached her in Italian repertoire at one point in time, because her major teacher was Orgeni, the student of Pauline Viardot. So anyway, that was the background that I went through. And I found the whole experience of singing and learning to sing, and sometimes singing in acting out and sort of doing parts of an opera together and things like that within groups. I found it, the best word I can think of is heartwarming. But at the same time, I had started going to the opera. It was about 1947, when I was about 17 years old, that I first, I had been taking lessons. So my teachers encouraged me to go to the opera. And I went to the City Opera, and I saw a performance of Traviata, and I remember a baritone waiting by I could see the wings in the old city center. if you were sitting on the side, you could see into the wings. And there was this, during the scene where Germont enters, I could see him waiting. And then he came out, and the baritone sang with Violetta, and I don't remember who the Violetta was, but I remember the baritone. And it was a large voice, fairly metallic voice, and to me it had a distinct slow vibrato. I remember it as sounding, and I thought, wow, you know what I mean? That's exactly what my teacher tells me not to do, to avoid and whatnot. Well, it turned out to be Richard Bonelli, but years and years later, I reviewed the Stanford Archives CD set of Richard Bonelli, in which one of them had a concert from around 1947 that he sang, and there's no slow vibrato. So my recollection, which was quite vivid, and that CD, which doesn't show that slow vibrato, are in conflict. But Bonelli was rather stiff and whatnot. And later, when I spoke to William Morin, who helped me with an article I was writing about Jean Dereshka, that was published in the Record Collector. Morin said that Bonelli in those later years used to take a role, used to sing to support a student. Like he had many students, and if one of his students was performing, he might take a role and be on stage with them. So a soprano who was working with him might requested that he perform. So that's why he was at that late stage performing at the City Opera. Bonelli was really the first famous singer I heard, and to me it was disappointing, and I didn't even know he was that famous at the time. The first Met performance I saw was at the end of 1948, when I saw a performance of Barbara Seville with a wonderful baritone who just was terrific. The voice was bright, alive, and he was little guy jumping around the stage, and that was Giuseppe Valdengo.
La, 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 che bel vivere, che bel piacere, che bel piacere, per un barbiere di qualità, di qualità. Mi chiedono, mi vogliono, donne e ragazzi, vecchi fanciulle, e poi la parrucca, e presto la balla, e poi la salsiccia, e il resto di lieti, tutti mi chiedono, tutti mi vogliono, tutti mi vogliono, tutti mi vogliono, poi la parrucca, presto la balla, tutti mi chiedono, ehi Figaro, 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 ahimè, che voglia, ahimè, che folla, una alla volta, per carità, per carità, per carità, una alla volta, una alla volta, una alla volta, per carità. Figaro, sono qua, ehi, Figaro, sono qua, Figaro qua, Figaro là, Figaro qua, Figaro là, Figaro su e Figaro giù e Figaro su e Figaro giù. Sono i mattoni della città, della città, della città, della città, della città. Ah, bravo Figaro, bravo, bravissimo, ah, bravo Figaro, bravo, bravissimo, fortunatissimo, 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 per verità, ah, bravo Figaro, bravo, bravissimo, ah, bravo Figaro, bravo, bravissimo, fortunatissimo, 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 per verità. Sono il fatto della città, sono il fatto della città, della città, della città.
Now, everybody remembers Valdengo from the Toscanini recordings, where he'd always pull Valdengo in to sing Amonasro or whatever. But when I first heard him in 1948, I heard him much later than that, and the voice was totally worn out except for the high D and E flat. It was like a two-note voice when I heard him much later as Rigoletto. The voice was very hoarse, and it was just within that high resonance area that he still had it. But when I heard him in 48, the voice was bright and alive throughout. In most of those early, complete pirated recordings that Valdengo is in, he usually is that, you know, in that early 48-50 period. Along with Valdengo, there was a tenor named Felix Knight, who was primarily known as an operetta singer. And I had a 78 set of Felix Knight from, I think, the Desert Song or something like that. But it was him singing, "If one flower grows in my garden, then da 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 da." And he takes a high C in that. But when he sang at the Met, it was a very thin, sort of fragile voice, small for the Metropolitan Opera House. And at the end of the first aria, "Se il nome," well, that's the second one. "Se il nome" is the second serenade. But he, at the end of the aria, he didn't get any applause, zero. But that sometimes happens in Barbieri. But the thing is that Knight got angry. And he took the whip that he was holding and he whipped the side of his leg like furious that he didn't get a reaction from the audience after he spun out, a run up to a high C, and nothing happened. So, and that was, I think, the only season he sang at the Met. But he did sing in a number of things. Then Italo Taio was Don Basilio, and Salvatore Baccalone was Bartolo. And I always thought that Patrice Munsell was doing Rosina, but when I looked it up in the annals, it seems somebody named Carmen Garcia, who I've never heard of and I don't remember, might have been singing Rosina. Whoever it was, Patrice Munsell or this Carmen Garcia, it was a generic coloratura voice, a high, thin soprano, and nothing memorable. But Taio was memorable, Baccalone was memorable, and Valdengo was memorable. Well, Taio was a performer beyond belief. He was like a singing actor, even when he used to come a few years ago and do Alcindoro in Bohème. He always dominated the stage, and he did it even more so when he was younger. He was an enormous ham. Baccalone, just with this big rolling voice and generous kind of, actions and authoritative manner, he was he was perfect. That was actually the first performance I ever saw at the Met.